Who told you that you could sit with the attorneys?
I'm not a defendant, Your Honor. I'm observing.
Whitmore's eyes dragged over her. Slow.
Observing.
He almost laughed.
Some uneducated black girl in a cheap coat wants to observe my courtroom. That's a new one.
He leaned into the microphone.
Tell me something. Does your kind even know what a courtroom is? Or did you wander in looking for the welfare line?
She didn't flinch. She pulled out a notebook, clicked a pin.
Your full name for the record, Your Honor?
His knuckles went white around the gavel.
Get this animal out of my courtroom before she stinks up the bench.
40 people heard it. Not one moved. Not one spoke. She kept writing. Harold Whitmore had 22 years on that bench, never once held accountable. He just handed her every reason to change that. Oh, but wait. You need to understand who this judge really was. Because this wasn't his first time. Jefferson County Courthouse had stood on the corner of Maple and 5th for 61 years. 3 stories of gray limestone, a flagpole out front that leaned slightly to the left. And on the second floor, behind a set of double oak doors that hadn't been oiled since the last century, sat Courtroom 4B. Harold Whitmore's courtroom. Not the county's, not the state's. His. 22 years he'd sat in that chair. 22 years of walking in at exactly 8:47 every morning, coffee in his left hand, a stack of folders in his right, and a look on his face that told every person in the room the same thing. You are beneath me. The clerks knew the look. They stopped talking whenever his footsteps echoed down the hallway. The bailiffs knew the rules. No coughing, no whispering, no eye contact unless spoken to first. Even the court reporters had learned to keep their heads down, fingers on the keys, mouths shut. Whitmore liked order. He liked silence. But most of all, he liked fear. Fear meant control, and control meant that nobody, not the attorneys, not the defendants, not the public defenders who shuffled in with wrinkled suits and hopeless cases, ever questioned him. And for 22 years, nobody did. There had been complaints, of course. Dozens of them. A young black attorney named Carla Stevens had filed one 6 years ago after Whitmore told her to speak English, not whatever they taught you in that community college. She withdrew the complaint 3 weeks later. No one knew why. No one asked. A public defender named Thomas Grant had tried to escalate a pattern of racial bias to the Judicial Review Board in 2019. The board sent a letter. Whitmore received it, read it, and tossed it in the trash in front of his clerk. "Tell them I said thank you," he said. Nothing happened. The complaints disappeared, the way complaints always disappear when the person they're about has friends in high places. Whitmore played golf with Senator Aldridge. He had dinner once a month with Chief Justice Pemberton. He donated to the right campaigns, attended the right fundraisers, and sat on the right boards. He was untouchable. And he knew it. That knowledge had done something to him over the years. It had hollowed out whatever accountability once lived inside him and replaced it with something worse. Certainty. The certainty that he was always right, that his judgment was final, that the people who stood before him were not citizens deserving fair treatment, but subjects in his kingdom. His clerks had a nickname for Courtroom 4B. They never said it out loud, but they all knew it. The throne room. There was one more thing about Whitmore that the people in his courtroom knew, but never discussed. He treated defendants differently, depending on what they looked like. It wasn't subtle. A white college student caught with cocaine would get probation and a lecture about potential. A black father caught with half the amount would get 18 months and a comment about personal responsibility. The pattern was there for anyone willing to see it, but seeing it meant acknowledging it. And acknowledging it meant doing something about it. And doing something about it meant going up against a man who had the power to ruin your career with a single phone call.
So nobody saw it. On the morning of October 14th, Harold Whitmore arrived at the courthouse at his usual time. He parked in his reserved spot, the one closest to the side entrance, the one with Judge Whitmore stenciled in white paint that he'd had retouched every spring.
He was in a bad mood. His docket was packed. 3 drug possession cases, a domestic dispute, a parole violation, and a civil rights complaint he'd been trying to dismiss for 2 months. His coffee was lukewarm. His back ached from the new mattress his wife had insisted on buying, and the weather had turned cold in a way that made his knees stiff. He walked through the side door, nodded once at the bailiff, didn't say good morning, never did.
The courtroom was already filling. Attorneys shuffled papers. Families sat in the gallery with hollow eyes and clasped hands. A few reporters from the local paper occupied the back row, notebooks open, pens ready. And in the second row, directly behind the bar partition, sat a woman he had never seen before.
She was black, mid-40s, simple navy coat, white blouse underneath. No briefcase, no legal pad. No badge clipped to her lapel. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, looking at the bench the way a building inspector looks at a foundation. Not with curiosity, with assessment. Whitmore noticed her the moment he stepped onto the platform. His eyes swept the room the way they always did, a king surveying his court, and landed on her. He paused, just for a second. Something about the way she sat, the stillness of her posture, the fact that she didn't look away when his gaze found hers. It bothered him. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why she was there. And he didn't care. What he knew, what 22 years of unchecked power had taught him, was that she didn't belong. Not in that row. Not in that coat. Not with that skin. He settled into his chair, adjusted the microphone, opened the first folder, but his eyes kept drifting back to the second row, to the woman who hadn't moved, who hadn't looked away, who sat like she owned the room more than he did. It was a feeling Harold Whitmore hadn't experienced in 2 decades. He didn't recognize it at first. It was the feeling of being watched by someone who wasn't afraid. Isabella Collins had driven 47 minutes that morning from her office in the state capital to Jefferson County. She'd left before sunrise. No driver, no assistant, no security detail. Just her, a thermos of black coffee, and a manila folder on the passenger seat, thick with complaints she'd been reading for the past 3 months. 17 formal grievances, 9 informal letters, 4 anonymous tips, all pointing to the same courtroom, all pointing to the same name, Harold Whitmore. She'd read every single one. Some were written in legal language, precise, detached, clinical. Those came from attorneys who knew how to protect themselves while still sounding the alarm. But the others, the ones from defendants and their families, those were different. One was from a woman named Denise Holloway, whose son had been sentenced to 18 months for a first-time misdemeanor. In her letter, she described how Whitmore had looked at her boy and said, "Another one for the system. At least you'll get 3 meals a day." Denise wrote that her son was 19, that he'd been accepted to community college, that the judge never once opened his file before handing down the sentence. Another came from a public defender who asked to remain anonymous. He described a pattern. Black and Latino defendants receiving consistently harsher sentences in Courtroom 4B. Not by a little, by a lot. First-time offenders getting maximum penalties. Bail set at amounts designed to be unpayable. Continuances denied without explanation. And always, always, the comments. Small, cutting remarks that never quite crossed the line into something actionable. Until they did. And when they did, nobody was recording. A third letter had come from a 26-year-old attorney named Patricia Wells. She had appeared before Whitmore for the first time on a pro bono domestic violence case. He interrupted her opening statement to ask if she'd borrowed that suit from her mother. When she tried to continue, he told her to speak up because he couldn't understand her accent. Patricia Wells was born in Ohio. She didn't have an accent. She quit practicing law 4 months later. Isabella had read Patricia's letter 3 times. The third time, she closed her office door and sat in silence for 10 minutes. She knew men like Whitmore. She'd known them her entire life. Growing up on the south side of Dayton, Ohio, Isabella had learned early what it meant to be judged before you spoke. Her mother, Gloria Collins, worked 3 jobs: morning shift at the hospital laundry, afternoon shift at a grocery store, and weekend cleaning at a law firm downtown. Gloria never finished high school, but she could quote case law she'd overheard from the attorneys whose offices she vacuumed every night. "Baby girl," she used to say, setting a plate of rice and beans on the table after midnight, still wearing her cleaning uniform. "They built these systems to keep us out. Your job is to walk in anyway." Isabella walked in. She walked into every room they said she didn't belong. Honors classes, where teachers assumed she'd been placed by mistake. The debate team, where a coach told her she didn't have the voice for it. Harvard Law School, on a full scholarship, graduating 3rd in her class while working 20 hours a week at a legal aid clinic in Roxbury. After graduation, she turned down 6 private firm offers, each one paying more than her mother made in 5 years combined. She took a position at a legal aid nonprofit in Columbus instead. For 3 years, she represented tenants facing eviction, workers denied wages, and families trapped in a system that was supposed to protect them. She lost sleep. She lost weight. She won cases that nobody thought were winnable. She walked into the State Bar Association as a junior member at 29. By 34, she sat on the ethics committee. By 38, she chaired it. At 41, she became the youngest president in the organization's 112-year history, the first black woman to hold the position. But titles meant nothing to Isabella if they didn't translate into action. She hadn't fought her way into the room to sit quietly and collect recognition. She'd come to change how the room operated. The complaints about Whitmore had landed on her desk through official channels, but it was the unofficial ones, the handwritten letters, the voicemails from crying mothers, the email from Patricia Wells, that made Isabella pick up her car keys that morning. She didn't send an investigator. She didn't schedule a formal review. She didn't call ahead. She drove. Because Isabella Collins had learned something in 20 years of legal work that most people in power never understood. The truth doesn't reveal itself when it knows you're watching. You have to catch it off guard. So she dressed simply. Navy coat, white blouse, dark slacks. No badge, no briefcase, no nameplate. She pulled her hair back, put on flat shoes, and left every visible marker of authority locked in her office drawer. She wanted to see what Harold Whitmore did when he thought nobody important was in the room. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:30, walked through the metal detector, smiled at the security guard who barely glanced at her, climbed the stairs to the second floor, pushed open the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B, and sat down in the second row. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, wrote the date at the top, drew a single line underneath it, and waited. She didn't have to wait long.
The first case that morning was a drug possession charge. A 23-year-old named Tyler Benson. First offense. Found with a small bag of marijuana during a routine traffic stop. His public defender, a tired-looking man in a suit that had seen better decades, stood beside him and argued for diversion. A first offender program that would keep the conviction off Tyler's record. Whitmore barely looked at the file. Denied.
The public defender blinked. Your Honor, the prosecution has already agreed to. I said denied. Next. Tyler Benson was sentenced to 6 months. His mother, in the back row, pressed both hands over her mouth. No sound came out. She'd learned, like everyone else in this room, that sound drew attention. And attention from Judge Whitmore was never the kind you wanted. Isabella wrote it down. The time, the case number, the sentence, the mother's face. She turned to a new line in her notebook and underlined it twice. The second case was a parole violation. A man named Samuel Crawford, 41, had missed a check-in with his parole officer because his car broke down. He had documentation, a tow receipt, a mechanic's invoice, a signed statement from his employer confirming he'd called in. His attorney presented all of it. Whitmore held up the tow receipt between 2 fingers like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe.
This doesn't prove anything. Your Honor, the receipt is dated. I can read, Counselor. What I'm reading is an excuse. He dropped the paper. It floated to the floor. Nobody picked it up. 30 days. County. Maybe next time you'll find a car that works. Samuel Crawford stood there, mouth open, eyes wide. 30 days for a broken-down car.
Isabella's pen moved across the page. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could hear everything. The crack in Samuel's voice when he said, "Yes, Your Honor." The shuffle of his shoes as the bailiff led him to the side door. The absolute silence of a room full of people who had just watched injustice happen and said nothing. It was somewhere around 9:15 when Whitmore's attention drifted back to the second row. Isabella had been sitting in the same position for 40 minutes. Straight back, navy coat buttoned, notebook open, writing. He'd noticed her when he first walked in. He'd noticed the way she didn't look down when he looked at her. And now? Now he noticed she was still writing, still watching, still there. It scratched at something inside him, a splinter he couldn't reach. He waited until the Crawford case was processed. Then he cleared his throat. You, in the second row. The courtroom shifted. Attorneys glanced over their shoulders. The bailiff near the side door straightened. Isabella looked up from her notebook. Her expression didn't change. She'd been expecting this. Yes, Your Honor? I've been watching you scribble in that notebook for the last 40 minutes. You're not an attorney. You're not a reporter. So what exactly are you doing in my courtroom? She closed the notebook, rested her hands on top of it. Observing, Your Honor, as is my right under the First Amendment. Whitmore's left eye twitched, just barely, but Isabella caught it. She'd spent her career reading faces across courtrooms, boardrooms, and hearing panels. She knew what that twitch meant. Control slipping. Observing, he repeated. He said it the way someone repeats a word they find amusing and offensive at the same time. And what exactly qualifies a woman like you to observe proceedings in a federal courtroom?
The Constitution qualifies me, Your Honor. A few attorneys exchanged glances. One, a young woman at the defense table, pressed her lips together to suppress what might have been a smile. Whitmore didn't smile.
Let me explain something to you. His voice dropped. Not softer, harder. The kind of quiet that fills a room the way cold fills a basement. This courtroom is not a public park. You don't just wander in off the street in a coat that looks like it came from a donation bin, sit wherever you please, and start taking notes like you're grading a school paper. He leaned forward. The leather of his chair groaned. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you crawled in from. But I've been doing this long enough to know when someone doesn't belong. He pointed the gavel at her. And sweetheart, you don't belong anywhere near this bench. You never did. And deep down, you know it too. The word sweetheart landed in the room like a slap across the face.
Every attorney in the room looked at their hands. The court reporter's fingers froze above the keys. The bailiff shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but didn't move. Isabella didn't react. Not visibly, but inside, something locked into place. A gear turning, a decision crystallizing. She'd come to observe, to gather information quietly, to build a case over weeks, maybe months. Harold Whitmore had just accelerated the timeline. She opened the notebook again, wrote one sentence, closed it, and waited for him to keep going. She knew he would. Men like Whitmore always did. He kept going. The next case on the docket was a domestic dispute, a woman named Angela Price seeking a restraining order against her ex-husband. But Whitmore barely processed it. His eyes kept sliding to the second row, to the notebook, to the pen that hadn't stopped moving since he'd first spoken to her. He rushed through Angela Price's hearing in 11 minutes. Denied the restraining order. Told her to work it out like adults. Angela sat down with shaking hands and tears running silently into her collar. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder, said nothing. There was nothing left to say in this room. Isabella added another line to her notebook, another name, another case, another failure. Whitmore called a recess at 9:40. Not because the docket required it, because he needed to regroup. He disappeared through the door behind the bench for 12 minutes. When he came back, his face had the look of a man who'd had a conversation with himself in the mirror and decided he was right. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at Isabella. We have a spectator in the gallery today, he announced to the room. Not to her. About her, as if she were a zoo exhibit. Apparently, she finds our proceedings educational. Maybe she's studying for her GED. A nervous laugh rippled through the first row. Two attorneys. They stopped the moment they realized no one else was laughing. Isabella didn't look up. She kept writing. That was what broke him. Not defiance, not argument, the writing. The quiet, steady, unshakable act of documentation. Every time Whitmore spoke, her pen moved. Every ruling, every comment, every word recorded. He couldn't see what she was writing, and that was worse than anything she could have said out loud. He leaned into the microphone. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time. Close that notebook. Isabella looked up, met his eyes, held them. No, Your Honor. The room went still. Not quiet, still.
The kind of stillness that happens in the seconds before something irreversible. Excuse me? I said no. This notebook is my personal property. I am within my legal rights to take notes in a public proceeding. You have no authority to compel me to stop. Whitmore's knuckles whitened around the gavel. His jaw tightened so hard, the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. You want to talk to me about authority? His voice was low, dangerous. I am the authority in this room. I decide what happens in here. I decide who speaks, who sits, who stays, and who goes. And right now, I am deciding that you are disrupting these proceedings. I haven't said a word, Your Honor. I've been sitting silently. Your presence is the disruption. The words hung in the air. Every person in that courtroom heard them. Your presence is the disruption. Not her behavior, not her actions, her presence, her existence in his space. A young attorney at the defense table, Douglas Bennett, 28, 3 years out of law school, stood up. His chair scraped the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. Your Honor, with respect, the observer has done nothing to warrant removal. She's exercising a constitutional right. Whitmore turned to him, slowly, the way a spotlight turns towards someone who just made the mistake of volunteering. Counselor Bennett, did I ask for your opinion? No, Your Honor, but then sit down, unless you'd like to join her. Bennett hesitated. His hands were shaking. He looked at Isabella, just for a second, and she gave him the smallest nod, almost invisible. It said, I see you. It's okay. Sit down. He sat. Whitmore turned back to Isabella. His face had gone past red into something darker, something that had been building for 22 years behind that bench. The rage of a man who had never been told no in his own kingdom and could not process the experience. I'm going to give you one final chance, he said. Close that notebook. Stand up. Walk out of my courtroom, or I will hold you in contempt and have you taken to a holding cell downstairs. Your choice. Isabella looked at him. She didn't close the notebook. She didn't stand. She clicked her pen once, a small, deliberate sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a gunshot. I'll stay, Your Honor. Thank you. Whitmore slammed the gavel. Contempt! Bailiff, remove her! The bailiff took one step forward, then stopped. He looked at Isabella, looked at Whitmore, looked at the room full of people who were all watching, all recording this moment on their phones held low against their laps. He didn't move. Nah, this is insane. Imagine you're sitting there, minding your own business, writing in a notebook, and a judge calls you an animal and wants to lock you up for it. In a public courtroom. Would you stay calm? Because I honestly don't think I could. The bailiff's name was Raymond Watts. He'd worked in courtroom 4B for 9 years. He'd seen Whitmore dress down attorneys. He'd seen him reduce defendants to tears. He'd watched him throw a water pitcher against the wall once during a sentencing hearing, and then act like nothing happened. But he'd never seen this. A woman sitting calmly while a judge unraveled in front of her. A notebook held like a shield. A pen that moved like a weapon. And a courtroom full of people who were watching something shift in real time, even if they couldn't name it yet. Raymond Watts took one step forward, then stopped. Bailiff? Whitmore's voice cracked on the second syllable. I gave you an order. Your Honor, she hasn't. She's in contempt. I've ruled. Remove her. Now. Raymond looked at Isabella. She sat exactly as she had been, back straight, notebook open, pen resting on the page. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look defiant. She looked like someone who had been in this exact position before and knew precisely how it would end. Raymond reached for her arm. His fingers hovered an inch from her sleeve. He couldn't bring himself to close the gap.
"It's all right," Isabella said quietly. Only he could hear it. "Do what you need to do. I'm not going anywhere." It was the gentleness in her voice that undid him. Not resistance. Certainty. The absolute, bone-deep certainty of a woman who knew the ground she stood on better than anyone else in that room. Raymond dropped his hand, stepped back, took his position by the door. "I can't remove her, Your Honor. She hasn't broken any law." The room exhaled. Whitmore's face went through 3 colors in 4 seconds. Pink, red, a deep bruised purple that started at his collar and climbed to his temples. His hands were shaking. The gavel trembled in his grip. "You," he pointed at Raymond, "you are done. You hear me? Done. I'll have your badge before lunch." Then he turned back to Isabella.
And this was the moment, the exact second, where Harold Whitmore's 22-year career began to end. Not because of what Isabella did, but because of what he chose to do next. He stood up. In 22 years on the bench, Harold Whitmore had never stood during a session. It was a point of pride. The bench elevated him. The robe distinguished him. Standing was for the people below. He ruled from above, but rage had pulled him to his feet. Rage and something deeper. The primal panic of a man who feels his authority bleeding out and can't find the wound. He leaned over the bench, both hands flat on the surface, veins running like rivers under the skin of his forearms.
"Let me tell you something," he said. His voice had dropped to a register that made the court reporter's hands shake. "I have been serving this court since before you were old enough to spell your own name. I have put away criminals. I have upheld the law. I have earned this seat. And you, some random black woman off the street with a $10 notebook, think you can sit in my courtroom and judge me?" He let the words land. Then he added 3 more. "Know your place."
The court reporter's hand stopped moving. She couldn't type anymore. Tears were running down her face. Attorney Bennett had his phone under the table, recording. The 2 reporters in the back row had stopped pretending to be casual. Their pens were moving as fast as Isabella's. A woman in the gallery, Denise Holloway, whose son had been sentenced that morning, was sobbing silently, her hands pressed against her chest. In the back row, an elderly man in a veteran's cap shook his head slowly. He'd come to support his grandson's sentencing hearing, scheduled for later that morning. He'd served 31 years in the military. He'd been called worse in his lifetime. But hearing it from a judge, from a man sworn to uphold equality under the law, that was something different. That was the system telling you, out loud, what it had always whispered. And Isabella Collins sat in the second row, with her notebook open and her pen still. She wasn't writing anymore. She was looking at Harold Whitmore with an expression that nobody in that courtroom had ever seen directed at him before. Not anger, not fear, not shock. Pity. She pitied him because she knew what he didn't. She knew what was coming. She knew that every word he'd said, every insult, every racial slur, every abuse of power had been spoken into a live microphone
transcribed by a court reporter, recorded on at least 3 phones, and documented in a notebook that would be entered as evidence in a formal judicial review. She knew that the man standing above her, shaking with rage, pointing his gavel like a weapon, had just ended his own career.
And he didn't even know it yet. Isabella looked at him one last time, calm, steady, the same way she'd looked at him when he first told her she didn't belong. Then she spoke. "Your Honor, before you proceed with the contempt charge, may I state my name for the record?" Whitmore laughed, a short, ugly sound that bounced off the oak walls. "Go ahead, it won't matter." Isabella stood, slowly, the way someone stands when they know the room is about to change. "My name is Isabella Collins." She paused, let it sit. "And I'd like to introduce myself properly. My name is Isabella Collins. I am the president of the State Bar Association. I hold authority over every licensed attorney in this state, including the one responsible for your appointment to this bench." She let the words settle, one by one, like stones dropped into still water. "I am here today conducting an unannounced review of judicial conduct in Courtroom 4B, following 17 formal complaints filed against you over the past 4 years. The silence that followed wasn't silence. It was the sound of 40 people holding their breath at the same time. It was the sound of every assumption in the room collapsing. It was the sound of a 22-year empire cracking at its foundation. Harold Whitmore's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. His face had gone from purple to white, a bloodless, ashen white, the color of a man watching his own house burn with him still inside it. That's not, he stammered. For the first time in 22 years on that bench, Harold Whitmore stammered. "You can't just... This is my courtroom. You can't walk in here without notice and..." "I can," Isabella said, "and I did. The State Bar Association has the authority to conduct unannounced reviews of any courtroom in this state. Article 7, Section 12 of the Judicial Conduct Code. A code you swore to uphold when you took that oath 22 years ago." She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small leather case, opened it. Inside was her official credential, the seal of the State Bar Association embossed in gold, her photo, her title, and her signature. She held it up. Not for Whitmore, for the room. "Let me tell you what I observed this morning." Her voice was steady, clear, the kind of voice that fills a room without rising. "In the past 90 minutes, I have witnessed the following violations of judicial conduct." She opened her notebook. The pages were dense with writing, small, precise letters in blue ink. She didn't need to read them. She'd memorized every word. But the notebook wasn't for her. It was for the record. 1. Case number 2024-JC-0847. Tyler Benson. A first-time offender eligible for diversion under state guidelines. The prosecution had already agreed to the program. You denied it without reviewing the case file and imposed a 6-month sentence. That constitutes an abuse of judicial discretion. 2. Case number 2024-JC-0851. Samuel Crawford. A parole violation with documented mitigating circumstances, including a tow receipt, a mechanic's invoice, and an employer's statement. You dismissed all evidence without consideration and imposed 30 days of county incarceration. That constitutes a failure to consider exculpatory evidence. 3. Case number 2024-JC-0855. Angela Price. A domestic violence victim seeking a restraining order. You denied it in 11 minutes and told her to, quote, work it out like adults. That constitutes a failure to protect a petitioner in a domestic violence proceeding. She paused, turned the page.
4. Racial bias. In the 90 minutes I've been present, you have referred to me, a black woman, as an animal, told me I didn't belong, mocked my education, suggested I was studying for my GED, and told me to know my place. These remarks were made into a live microphone in open court in front of 43 witnesses and were transcribed by your court reporter.
She looked at the court reporter. The woman was crying, but her hands were back on the keys. She nodded. Once. She had it all.
5. Abuse of contempt power. You threatened to hold me in contempt and have me jailed for exercising my constitutional right to observe a public proceeding. You also threatened to fire bailiff Raymond Watts for refusing to execute an unlawful order. She closed the notebook. The sound was quiet, but in that room it landed like the closing of a cell door.
Your Honor, she said, and the two words carried a weight that pressed the air out of the room. Based on what I have personally witnessed and documented today, I am initiating an immediate formal investigation into your conduct, effective now. Whitmore gripped the edge of the bench. His knuckles were bone white. His breath came in short, shallow pulls. The robe that had made him look powerful an hour ago now looked like a costume. Oversized, ridiculous, draped over a man who had shrunk inside it. You can't. I have connections. I know Senator Aldridge. I know Chief Justice Pemberton. You think you can just—
Senator Aldridge has no jurisdiction over judicial conduct reviews. Neither does Chief Justice Pemberton. The Bar Association operates independently. That's the whole point. She let it land.
But I want to be clear about something. Isabella stepped into the center aisle. She wasn't behind the bar partition anymore. She was standing in the open, between the gallery and the bench, in the space where attorneys stood to argue their cases. This investigation isn't personal. I didn't come here to embarrass you. I came here to protect the people who stand in front of you every day. The people you were sworn to serve. The people whose lives you've been treating like inconveniences. She turned to the room, to the attorneys, to the families, to Angela Price, still shaking, to Denise Holloway, still crying, to Samuel Crawford's empty chair. I see you, she said, and I'm sorry it took this long. Attorney Douglas Bennett stood up, slowly. Then the young woman at the defense table. Then a man in the third row. Then Denise Holloway, still wiping her eyes. One by one they stood, not in applause, not in celebration, in recognition, in witness. Whitmore looked out at his courtroom, at the people who had feared him for 2 decades, who were now standing for someone else. He sat down heavily. The gavel slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. Nobody picked it up. The call was made at 10:47 that morning. Isabella walked out of courtroom 4B into the hallway, pulled her phone from her coat pocket, and dialed the direct line to the State Bar Association's Office of Judicial Discipline. She spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She gave dates, case numbers, witness names, transcript confirmation. She requested an emergency session of the Judicial Review Panel. By noon, the order was signed. Judge Harold Whitmore was suspended from the bench, effective immediately. No cases, no hearings, no access to courtroom 4B. His key card was deactivated by 1:15. His nameplate was removed from the door by 2 o'clock.
The white stenciled letters in his parking spot were painted over before he even made it to his car. He stood in the parking lot at 2:22 in the afternoon, holding a cardboard box of personal items, his coffee mug, a framed photo with Senator Aldridge, a leather-bound copy of the Constitution he kept on his desk, and stared at the blank gray rectangle where his name used to be. For the first time in 22 years, Harold Whitmore had no courtroom. The news broke that evening. A local reporter named Janet Chapman had been in the gallery that morning. She'd been covering a routine docket story when everything changed. Her article, filed at 3 o'clock, published at 5 o'clock, was the first to carry the headline, "State Bar President Confronts Judge After Racial Abuse in Open Court." It was shared 400 times in the first hour. By nightfall, 3 cell phone videos surfaced. Different angles, different moments, but they all captured the same thing. Whitmore's voice, amplified by the courtroom microphone, saying the words that would define the end of his career. Know your place. The video with those 3 words reached 2 million views in 48 hours. Then, the floodgates opened. Former defendants came forward. Families who'd sat in that gallery for years and never said a word because they believed no one would listen. Attorneys who had filed complaints that went nowhere. Court staff who had witnessed things they'd been too afraid to report. Carla Stevens, the attorney who'd withdrawn her complaint 6 years earlier, gave a televised interview. She explained why she'd withdrawn it. Whitmore had called her supervising partner and suggested that her attitude problem might reflect poorly on the firm. She was told to drop it or find a new job. She dropped it. Thomas Grant, the public defender who'd tried to flag the pattern in 2019, released the data he'd been compiling for 5 years. Exposed side by side, the numbers were staggering. Black defendants in courtroom 4B received sentences averaging 42% longer than white defendants charged with identical offenses. Latino defendants received sentences 31% longer. The disparity wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was arithmetic. The Judicial Review Panel convened 11 days after Isabella's visit. The hearing lasted 3 days. 14 witnesses testified. The court reporter from courtroom 4B, a woman named Ellen Torres, read her transcript aloud. Her voice shook, but she read every word, every insult, every order, every silence from the people who watched and said nothing. On the 3rd day, the panel voted unanimously. Harold Whitmore was formally removed from the bench. His law license was suspended pending further review. A referral was made to the state attorney general's office to investigate potential civil rights violations spanning his entire tenure. Senator Aldridge released a statement distancing himself. Chief Justice Pemberton issued a formal apology on behalf of the judiciary. The golf games stopped. The dinner invitations dried up. The fundraiser seats were quietly reassigned. The kingdom was gone. Isabella held a press conference the following morning. She stood behind a podium in the State Bar Association's headquarters. The room was packed. Cameras from 6 stations, reporters from national outlets. She wore the same navy coat. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She didn't mention Whitmore's name once. "This isn't about one judge," she said. "This is about a system that allowed one judge to operate unchecked for 22 years. That's the failure. Not one man's prejudice, but an entire structure's tolerance of it." She announced 3 immediate actions. First, A statewide audit of judicial conduct complaints, how they were filed, how they were processed, and how many had been buried. Second, the creation of an independent oversight body with the power to conduct unannounced courtroom reviews in every county. Third, a victims' advocacy program for defendants and families who had been subjected to judicial misconduct. A reporter asked her how she felt when Whitmore called her an animal.
Isabella paused, looked at the camera.
I felt what every black woman in this country feels when someone with power tries to reduce her to less than human. I felt it. And then I kept writing.
The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then the questions resumed. But something had changed. In that silence, in those 3 seconds, every person in that room understood that Isabella Collins hadn't walked into courtroom 4B looking for a fight. She'd walked in looking for the truth.
And the truth had been worse than any of them imagined. 1 year later, courtroom 4B reopened under a new name. The county voted to rename it. Not after a judge, not after a senator, after a principal. The brass plaque beside the oak doors now read, Equal Justice Courtroom. Installed on a Tuesday morning. No ceremony, just a maintenance worker, a drill, and 4 screws. The new presiding judge was Victoria Ashford. 44. Former civil rights attorney. She'd spent a decade representing the exact kind of people Whitmore spent his career crushing. On her first day, she introduced herself to every clerk and bailiff by name and left her chamber door open. She never closed it. Tyler Benson's conviction was overturned on appeal. He enrolled in community college that fall, the same program he'd been accepted to before Whitmore sentenced him. He was studying criminal justice. His mother drove him to campus on the first day. Samuel Crawford was released after review. The tow receipt was admitted as evidence. His record was expunged. Angela Price received her restraining order. A different judge read her file in full and granted it without hesitation. Carla Stevens returned to practicing law. She opened her own firm, specializing in judicial misconduct cases. Douglas Bennett left his firm to join a national civil rights organization. He trained young lawyers to identify and report judicial abuse. Every presentation began the same way: a photo of a small leather notebook and the words, "This is the most powerful weapon in any courtroom." Thomas Grant's data was cited in a landmark legislature hearing. The bill that followed, the Collins Act, mandated annual independent audits of sentencing patterns in every courtroom in the state. It passed unanimously. Ellen Torres, the court reporter whose tears had fallen onto her stenotype that morning, was promoted to lead court reporter for the district. She gave a speech at the annual Judiciary Conference about the responsibility of the record. The transcript doesn't care about power, she said. It only cares about truth. Raymond Watts stayed. He requested a transfer to Judge Ashford's courtroom. Same side door, same uniform. But for the first time in 9 years, he didn't dread walking through it. Harold Whitmore was last seen leaving a disciplinary hearing in a gray suit with no tie. No cameras followed him. No reporters called his name. He walked to his car alone. The man who once commanded silence in a room of 40 people now couldn't get a single person to look at him. And Isabella Collins. She kept driving. Every month, a different county, a different courtroom. Never called ahead, never wore a badge. Just a navy coat, a white blouse, and a notebook. She'd walk in, sit down, open to a fresh page, and watch. On a cold January morning, 13 months after Courtroom 4B, Isabella walked into a courthouse she'd never visited, sat in the third row, opened her notebook, wrote the date. A judge entered, took the bench, looked out at the gallery. His eyes passed over her without stopping. She clicked her pen and started writing.
Man, what if that was your mom sitting in that chair? Your sister? What would you do if some judge looked at the person you love and said, "Know your place"? Drop that in the comments. Share this. Subscribe. Because stories like this, they need to be loud.